Welcome back everyone. Let's go ahead and take a look at the Samsung Galaxy A20 and see how this specific phone holds up in 2022. Now, like I mentioned before, the Samsung Galaxy A20 is a very good phone. I mean, this thing has a ton of capability within it, but it had a lot of capability because of its price tag and because of the year that it came out. I don't necessarily think this phone is really worth it anymore, but it's still kind of interesting to look at because this was a pretty budget phone when it first came out. It wasn't supposed to be competing with the Galaxy S10 of that time or the iPhone XS, or iPhone 11s later on that year. This was supposed to compete pretty much within and of itself and maybe some other budget offerings like, LG or Motorola at that specific time at those cheaper price tags. Now, if you want to go buy some phones that I would recommend this year, links will be down in the description. You can get them from there and you can help support the channel at the same time. Now, starting off with the outside, first of all, this phone came out in 2019, so it's approaching 3 years old as of this year. And the outside of this phone is very, very interesting. On the front, we have a Super AMOLED 6.4-inch 720p display. Now, this is actually very interesting because the jump from an A10 to an A20, from the display standpoint, it's actually a pretty big jump and you're getting a pretty good display from this specific phone. Now, if I were to go ahead and rewind back several years to the Samsung Galaxy S3, that phone had I think 5.4, whatever it was. It pretty much had a 720p Super AMOLED display at that time, and I think it came out around 2013. And funny enough, when I saw that screen at that time, I was shocked. I could not actually believe how good of a display that was, and I was super jealous. I had an Nexus 4 that had an IPS panel, and I really wanted an AMOLED display. And now that these cheap budget phones from 2019 had Super AMOLED displays, it's actually very interesting. It's not the best looking display, but the fact that it's a Super AMOLED, the fact that it has the Infinity V display, and the fact that it's almost kind of bezel-less is actually pretty interesting. So I will definitely say from just that standpoint alone, the display is actually worthy of a decent title. Now at the bottom, we do have a micro USB port on this thing, which is totally okay. Definitely not an ugly looking panel by any means. And on the back, we kind of have a plastic back. So this phone is primarily built out of plastic. So there's no extra accessories or anything like that for the most part. But again, I don't think it's that crazy big of a deal in my opinion. Now we do have a fingerprint sensor on the back as well, which is super cool. We can go in and unlock our phone that way, which is really nice. And we have a dual camera setup as well. Now we'll go ahead and hit on everything probably a little bit later, but I will tell you from the exterior of this phone, it's actually pretty interesting, like I mentioned before, that these developers were able to basically make a phone like this of this caliber at this time. This is a budget phone, but I don't necessarily look at it as like a super cheap phone. It's very, very interesting. And I do like how Samsung made these type of A series of devices because they did a great job. Now this phone also has a micro SD card slot built in as well, which is even crazier. The fact that this phone has that type of capability, from this type of, area is super insane to me. Mostly because a lot of phones nowadays, they don't have micro SD card slots, but a budget phone from 2019 actually has that type of capability, which is so amazing to me. So when I look at the exterior of this phone, I love it. And I think this phone definitely holds up from a budget phone standpoint in 2019. I don't think it holds up that well anymore, just because the successors of this phone have pretty much been so much better than this device. Now, speaking about the cameras, we do have a dual camera setup. We have a 13 megapixel wide-angle lens, then we have a 5 megapixel ultra-wide sensor. We also have an 8 megapixel front-facing camera. Now, this camera, although it's a dual camera setup and it does have an ultra-wide sensor, this is not a great camera. This is not a good camera. I think the Galaxy S8's camera is probably better than this thing, but you do have to keep in mind, one, it's a budget phone, so it totally makes sense. But two, this thing, there's no 4K, there's only 1080p on the front and the back. And that ultra-wide sensor, it's nice having it, but it's very strange to have an ultra-wide sensor that's less megapixel count than the wide-angle lens, just because, in my opinion, you need the same, if not more, megapixels to make it a not pixelated image, since you're getting way more into a frame. And that's another thing I've kind of had to take a look at. So with something like the Galaxy A20, the fact that it has an ultra-wide sensor is really cool, but there's not that much capability built in with this specific phone from all angles. So even though it's a budget phone, you do have to kind of give it some credit here and there for it to have this type of camera quality. But I don't think in 2022, this is like the camera you should go and pick up. And like I mentioned, the Galaxy S8, I think a Galaxy S9's camera is probably better than this thing, and it is definitely better than this thing. But again, it's totally understandable, and from back in the day, I think this thing makes total sense in my opinion. Now moving on to the software, this is, like I mentioned, probably the weirder aspect of these phones. They all had one UI, which is good, but because it's running pretty much the same One UI as the Galaxy S10 and Galaxy S20, this thing doesn't have that much power built in within it. So there's a lot of background processes, there's a lot of different things like that going on in the background of this phone that kind of put it in a weird area. It's not necessarily a super outdated phone or a super, weird phone in that standpoint, but it's just not that great of a performing phone from the software standpoint. This thing didn't really get too many software updates after either, so you're kind of stuck in a situation again where this phone isn't really at its highest caliber in terms of software. But like I mentioned, I think that's totally okay, and I think this phone actually ended up becoming a good phone in terms of price. Like when you first bought it, it may have been good, but I think as of right now, it's definitely in a different situation. So that kind of covers it up in terms of a software standpoint without getting super crazy within it. Now, speaking about the performance, this device does have that Exynos 7884 chipset inside of it and octa-core CPU with 3 gigabytes of RAM. Now, what I will definitely tell you, as I mentioned before, it's very interesting that a budget phone like this has this type of capability. Like how does Samsung do such a good job with this type of device? And this is why I think so many people still love the Galaxy A20 and why so many people look at this phone as a really good budget phone. It had 3 gigabytes of RAM, which was substantially more than what the predecessor or the A10 had. This thing also had an AMOLED display, which was nice, but it also had 3 gigabytes of RAM, and it wasn't a super bad or super great performing phone. This phone's performance was actually pretty good, and I do think that's one of the better areas of this specific phone. Now, in this day and age, it's definitely not that great of a performing phone, and I think that's one of the more important things to keep in mind. I'm not trying to say this is the best phone to pick up anymore, but again, for this type of phone, for it being what it was, I think it's actually pretty cool that Samsung was able to make a budget phone like this. And if you're trying to play basic games, or if you're trying to, just do light apps like this and that, then possibly back in 2019, this was a pretty decent phone, but it's not really that good of a phone anymore. So in terms of that kind of covers it up there. Now, in terms of battery, this is another very interesting thing about this phone. 4,000 mAh battery inside of this device, which is super, super crazy. Again, having a phone like this, it's a budget phone, but it has a really big size battery inside of it. That's honestly one of my favorite things about this phone. Now, it's non-removable, but again, having a phone like this of this caliber at that time is actually very interesting, and I'm super happy that, Samsung was able to make a phone like this that was a budget tier device. So honestly, this kind of takes us to the end of the video. And more than anything, what I would definitely tell you is that this phone isn't really worth it in this day and age. I don't necessarily think this is the phone you should go and, pick up. But I will say, for a phone of 2019, for it being a budget phone, I'm actually surprised how great of a job Samsung did. Now, this, again, is not the phone I would recommend you to buy. This is not the phone that, even a budget phone of 2022, you're getting a much better experience from something like the Galaxy A series of 2022, especially in 2021. So Samsung, devices that Samsung made for the A series in 2021 were spectacular, but I don't think they're just worth it in this day and age. And that's totally understandable. Like I mentioned, when you're getting a phone like this, you may be expecting a much better experience because you see it has a decent amount of RAM, and you see it has, 3 gigabytes of RAM and 4,000 mAh battery, and it has pretty good specifications inside of it, but it's just not the phone I would recommend buying. And that's pretty much how to kind of sum it up in this specific video. So that kind of covers it up there. If you guys have any other questions or anything like that, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.